Some rivalries in American public life burn hot and fade within a news cycle. This isn't one of those. The relationship between President Donald Trump and late-night host Jimmy Kimmel stretches back more than a decade, and rather than cooling with time, it has escalated into something closer to a running institutional conflict, one that has touched network suspensions, FCC threats, a Supreme Court justice's public rebuke, and multiple award show ambushes. This is the story of how a talk show rivalry became one of the defining media feuds of Trump's second term. Before the presidency, the two men's public history goes back further than most people remember. Trump appeared on Jimmy Kimmel Live in May 2016, months before he won his first presidential election, in what was, at the time, a fairly ordinary late-night campaign stop, the kind every major candidate does. That relationship did not stay ordinary for long. As Trump's political career advanced, late-night hosts increasingly turned him into a recurring target, mocking his campaign, his mannerisms, and eventually his presidency. And Kimmel became one of the most consistent voices doing it. By the time Trump returned to the White House for his second term, the dynamic between the two men had calcified into something closer to a running rivalry than a series of isolated jokes. The Charlie Kirk flashpoint. The feud's modern chapter ignited in September 2025, following the assassination of Turning Point USA co-founder Charlie Kirk. During a monologue addressing the killing, Kimmel criticized what he called the MAGA gang for trying to score political points off Kirk's death, and mocked the president's own public response, comparing Trump's focus on unrelated matters to how a young child might process grief. The backlash was immediate. Federal Communications Commission Chair Brendan Carr publicly criticized the monologue, and within hours, Disney-owned ABC announced that Jimmy Kimmel Live would go off the air indefinitely. Trump celebrated the suspension in a Truth Social post, calling it great news for America and thanking ABC for finally having the courage to do what had to be done. He didn't stop at Kimmel in the same stretch. He took shots at other late-night hosts, dismissing Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers in similarly blunt terms. The suspension triggered exactly the kind of backlash a media company doesn't want. Subscription cancellations for Disney Plus reportedly spiked, and critics inside and outside the entertainment industry framed the move as a capitulation to political pressure rather than a standard programming decision. Within about a week, ABC reversed course and put Kimmel back on the air. He used his return monologue to defend himself, describing the reaction to his original comments as something he believed had been distorted, and I think maliciously, by parts of right-wing media. Kimmel wasn't the only late-night casualty of this period. Around the same time, CBS announced it would not renew The Late Show with Stephen Colbert despite Colbert having a contract extension through 2026, a decision that came, notably, while parent company Paramount was seeking regulatory approval for its multi-billion-dollar merger with Skydance Media, a merger the FCC ultimately approved. Whether or not the two events were directly connected, the optics fueled a broader narrative about political pressure reshaping late-night television. The war of words escalates. The détente didn't last. By December 2025, Trump was back on Truth Social, posting on November 19th that ABC should get the bum off the air. Kimmel responded the following night on his own show, noting dryly that he'd lost count of how many times the president had called for his firing, and needling Trump that his September attempt hadn't worked either. Then came a twist that showcased just how personal and public this rivalry had become. On December 6th, during an Oval Office ceremony honoring that year's Kennedy Center honorees, Trump again criticized Kimmel's talent, according to reporting at the time. 2 days later, on December 8th, Bloomberg reported that Kimmel had signed a one-year extension with ABC, keeping Jimmy Kimmel Live on the network through May 2027, a deal that landed squarely in the middle of the president's public campaign to get him removed. The rivalry then migrated onto the awards show circuit. At the January 2026 Critics' Choice Awards, Kimmel accepted the award for Best Talk Show with an acceptance speech aimed squarely at his rival, thanking our president, Donald Jennifer Trump, without whom, he joked, the show wouldn't have won. It was a pointed reminder that the controversy surrounding his suspension had, in his telling, only strengthened his show's cultural relevance. The Correspondents' Dinner Collision Course. By March 2026, the feud had a new stage to play out on. Trump announced via Truth Social that he had accepted an invitation to attend the White House Correspondents' Association dinner for the first time as a sitting president, describing his own upcoming appearance in characteristically superlative terms. The event's organizers, notably, had already moved away from a traditional comedian host, opting for a mentalist instead, a shift widely read as a defensive move following the previous year's controversy over a rescinded comedian invitation. Kimmel didn't let that pass quietly. On his March 3rd broadcast, he called the choice of a mentalist over a comedian a cop-out, and directly pitched himself to host the dinner instead, addressing Trump on camera and asking for the assignment as something he said he'd never asked the president for before. The president did not take him up on the offer. Kimmel's show staged its own unofficial version of the event anyway, days ahead of the actual dinner. During the bit, he delivered a joke about First Lady Melania Trump having what he described as a glow comparable to that of an expectant widow, a line clearly built around the couple's age gap that Kimmel would later say was intended that way and nothing more. Crisis at the Correspondents' Dinner. What happened next elevated the dispute well beyond typical late-night sparring. A shooting occurred at the 2026 White House Correspondents' Dinner itself, an attack widely described as a failed assassination attempt. And in its immediate aftermath, the Trump administration's attention snapped back to the expectant widow joke Kimmel had made just days earlier. Both the president and First Lady Melania Trump publicly called for Kimmel to be fired over the remark, and Kimmel found himself kept off the air again, this time for roughly a week. Melania Trump went further than her husband in some of her public comments during this period, accusing Kimmel of spreading hostility through network television, while relying on a BC's institutional support to shield him from consequences. Trump, for his part, escalated beyond calls for firing and threatened to sue a BC directly over the fallout. When public backlash again forced the network to reinstate the show, Kimmel used his return to explain the joke, insisting he'd simply been referencing the age difference between the president and First Lady, and that the backlash had been driven by bad faith interpretation rather than the joke's actual intent. Neither side backs down. If anyone expected the reinstatement to produce a lasting truce, the following months proved otherwise. At the 2026 Oscars, Kimmel used his presenting slot to mock both Trumps, taking aim at Melania Trump's recently released documentary, which had drawn a poor audience reception, and landing a line about international press freedom that pointedly grouped CBS in with North Korea as places where free speech doesn't seem to fare well, a reference to the network's earlier multi-million-dollar settlement with Trump over a 60-minute story. Through the summer, the material kept coming. At the G7 summit in June 2026, Kimmel mocked what he called Trump's increasingly childish behavior on the world stage, joking about the president's complaints over chair height and room temperature, and comparing the experience of foreign leaders managing him to opening a shaken soda can. Ahead of Trump's 4th of July rally between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, Kimmel predicted the event would go worse than the president's recent birthday celebration, joking that Trump would want all the fireworks, after already demolishing part of the White House's East Wing earlier in the year. Guest host Tiffany Haddish later piled on when the turnout for Trump's Independence Day festivities came in lower than advertised, joking about the sparse crowds in blunt, self-deprecating comparisons that drew a strong reaction from Trump on Truth Social the next morning. By late July 2026, Trump was still actively engaging. On July 26th, he shared what appeared to be an AI-generated cartoon depicting Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, and Stephen Colbert as street beggars holding signs reading, "Talentless. Not funny, ex-comedians need money," with "Late Night is over" painted on a wall behind them, a striking illustration of just how personally and visually the feud continued to play out, nearly a year after the original Kirk-related suspension. The institutional angle. What separates this feud from a garden-variety celebrity spat is the amount of institutional machinery it has pulled in. The FCC's involvement in Kimmel's original suspension drew criticism, not just from media advocates, but eventually from within the judiciary itself. Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch was reported to have publicly called out FCC Chair Brendan Carr over his targeting of Kimmel, a notable moment given the judiciary's general reluctance to weigh in on active political and regulatory disputes. That single episode illustrates how what began as a comedian mocking a president has, at various points, implicated broadcast regulation, corporate merger politics, and questions about the boundaries of executive pressure on a private network. Why this feud won't die? Here's an honest assessment of why this dispute has outlasted almost every other Trump-era media conflict, rather than fading the way most celebrity feuds do. Both men have clear incentives to keep it alive. For Kimmel, the conflict has been demonstrably good for relevance, and by his own account at the Critics' Choice Awards, good for ratings. A suspended, reinstated, repeatedly targeted host makes for a more compelling watch than a routine one. For Trump, Kimmel functions as a reliable foil, a way to rally supporters against what the administration frames as biased media, and a subject he returns to even when there's no fresh news peg, as the late July cartoon post shows. There's also a structural reason this dispute keeps resurfacing. It sits at the intersection of several genuinely disputed questions that don't resolve themselves quickly. How far a sitting administration can go in pressuring a private broadcaster, whether FCC leadership used its regulatory authority appropriately in the Kimmel suspension, and how corporate media parents like Disney and Paramount should navigate protecting both their business interests and their journalistic and creative independence when a White House applies public pressure. Reasonable people land in different places on these questions. Some see Kimmel's suspension and subsequent conflicts as evidence of a White House willing to use regulatory leverage to punish unfavorable coverage, a First Amendment concern raised across much of the entertainment industry and by figures like Gorsuch. Others see a comedian who has, on multiple occasions, taken deliberately provocative shots at a president and his family, and view Trump's public criticism as a fair response many public figures face when they're mocked on national television, even if the FCC's specific role in triggering the initial suspension raises separate and legitimate regulatory questions of its own. What's not in serious dispute is the pattern itself: a suspension followed by reinstatement, a truce followed by a fresh provocation, an insult followed by a counterpunch delivered from an award show podium or a late-night desk. Kimmel remains under contract with a BC through May 2027, which means, as things currently stand, both men have every opportunity and apparently every intention to keep this going. Whether that's healthy for American political and media culture is a separate question from whether it's over. And based on everything that's happened just in the past few weeks, it clearly isn't.